All right, fine. I'll do a long form. The reason is there's a lot I have to say, but I'm trying to keep it small enough, so hopefully this isn't a full 10 minutes. But I can only release a certain amount of videos a day before they get, like, banned. Like, there's, like, this weird thing you post too much, and then all of a sudden, like, nobody sees it. So enough about that. Well, I did have one last thing. It's really funny to me because I do come across a lot of content like on the YouTube sphere as well, where people become ex-Christian and like talk smack about all of Christianity, and I'm still a Christian and I'll talk smack, but it's funny that I'm still a Christian. This is my own personal conviction, but for me, it's like you know how Paul would talk snark like in Corinthians and stuff like that. Similar idea when he would say things like, "Oh, I can't even hold a finger up to the super apostles." Anyway, let's talk about this church. The reason I have such a big problem with the rigidity is this. I grew up in a church where you had to follow all these different rules to earn God's favor. And yes, you earned God's favor. And your faith was on really shaky ground if you didn't do one of the things we said you had to do. When reading the New Testament, and sorry for those non-Christians out there, but I am a Christian, so I am using Christianese here. When you look at how the New Testament was founded, the whole concept was to bring people together, not to tear them apart. Yes, there were doctrinal issues that were covered in the New Testament church that they were trying to like keep the faith pure. The things that they were criticizing back then are very different than the things that the denominations chastise each other over today. There is definitely a lack of unity, and that is what I see here. The unity within is fine, but everything else is viewed as dangerous in terms of faith-shaking territory. Good example of this is the use of King James Bible as the definitive version of the Bible. I think we need to remember that most Jews at the time of Christ's coming spoke Greek. It was a huge diaspora that was linked together by the Greek language, and they had a Greek version of the Hebrew and Aramaic text. I don't think that they were any less Jewish because of the Greek translation. But funnily enough, there were definitely Jewish thinkers that thought that use of the Greek translation was heretical. The Sadducees, for example, had a big problem with it. But the New Testament was spread out in Greek. And the Greek version that we have today is not the same. So Greek back then only had capital letters. There were no small letters. Pick up a Greek Bible today and tell me what you see. What about the Hebrew letters? They changed a lot. So just imagine what happened when you had Pentecost, and funny enough, we're talking about a Pentecostal movement, when you had Pentecost, when all the languages came together, and it was just a really interesting time when all these different cultures were trying to figure out how to live together under unity. One thing they really tried to steer away from was conformity. There's a whole section in the book of Acts when they're like, we're only going to put 4 restrictions on you. 4 out of the 600 plus laws of the actual written code, not to mention the oral code. So it's really funny to me that churches are so hell-bent on the concept of you gotta follow this way of thinking. To me, that's just like the book of Ezra and Nehemiah when they build the walls and stuff like that according to their own desires and rip people's hair out if they don't conform. Same thing with the speaking of tongues upon immersion. That a Christian is not a Christian if they don't speak in tongues upon baptism? I would really love for someone to tell me I'm not a Christian. Oh, and it's definitely happened before. But I beg to ask, where's the inclusivity of that? And for everyone's information, yeah, I do speak in tongues, but never in the presence of other people. I have slipped a couple of times, but what I mean is I am one of those who believe that speaking in tongues is a personal affair, not a group affair. Can it be a group affair? Sure, but it does tend to freak new people out. And I will say this, when I speak in tongues, it doesn't sound like the typical way that people think of speaking in tongues. So if I were to bust out in tongues in the middle of a Pentecostal congregation thing, I don't know how well it would be received because it doesn't sound similar. And no, I'm not giving an example because to me that is personal. But I'm not about to say that speaking in tongues in a Pentecostal congregation is not Christian. But I am going to say that if you believe that you have to speak in tongues to be a Christian, that's rigid. And I do have a problem with this church's concept of family living. From what I can see in everything I've looked at so far, now I could be wrong, how much is singlehood encouraged? I made a vow. That's why my hair is long. I will not get married. But I do wonder if I were to join a church like this, if I would be told to cut my hair. If you come to me with scissors, I will definitely fight back. But I have encountered Pentecostal churches that have absolutely said that the way is through marriage and having as many children as possible. How about that whole section where Paul said if you can afford not to, then don't? But you never see in congregations like these singlehood as some sort of valid option. Instead, it's treated as second class at best. And I've talked ad nauseum about head coverings too, just in different videos, and I'm not going to say the same thing over again. But men with long hair were seen as not, I'm talking New Testament theology, were seen as not being virile. Which makes sense, because vow taking meant that you start with a shaved head and you let it grow long. My vow is lifelong, so... And there's like this whole thing in this particular church that women should never cut their hair. Did they take a Nazarene vow? All the Bible says is, make sure you're women. When it comes into the transsexual sphere, I honestly don't have answers. Do I judge people for being trans? No. Do I think the New Testament is against the concept of men becoming women and women becoming men? Yeah. But the Old Testament had a big deal with Israelites not mixing with Gentiles, and then the next thing you know, in Christianity, they do. So why are we limiting God's grace to what was written in the New Testament? I mean, who knows? Maybe a third testament's on the horizon. Basically, what I'm trying to say is I have a big issue when churches try to put God into a box. And with this church, I do see a very earnest attempt to put him into a box with nice tape on the top. So my content is more like, let's take some box cutters to this. There's more than one way to look at things. Now, the big banger. What does it mean to be a Christian, at least the way that I see it? What does Christianity mean? Well, you worship God, and when loving God, you love your neighbor, and actually view your neighbor as better than you. I don't think that Jesus likes to go around and look at people and be like, did you have your head covering? Did you use the old King James? Did you wear pants? I mean, where's the grace in that? Take it from someone who comes from a cult where grace was kind of kicked out the window. I mean, this could not be truer. So, I made a video a couple weeks ago maybe that said, well, what is legalism and in comparison to all this stuff that we hear? There is one law that Christians are to follow, and that is love God and love neighbor. Everything else is legalism. There's even a section in Romans 2 that basically says that people who don't even know God can do this because it's written on their hearts. Think of the parable of the Samaritan. That's like us saying a Muslim did that. And I don't think anyone would say that the Samaritan in that parable did not get God's favor. So why do we continue to say, oh, that's fine, but we'll still try to put God into a box? It doesn't make any sense to me. To me, Christianity should be packed with diversity and different understandings. Not even the people in the New Testament always agreed, and I don't think they called each other any less Christian. Although some funny terms like fox were thrown around. Hey, we're all in this space rock trying to find our way around together. So let's stop being dogmatic about it. Rigid beliefs are one thing, but pushing rigid beliefs on others, I just have a huge problem with. And churches typically are breeding grounds for such ways of thinking. God gave us brains, so let's use them and not suppress them.